Chapter 22 of The Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22 Measuring Human Influence. With careful tact did Mrs. Temple watch for just the right opportunity for checking any restiveness in the heart of her guests. She realized that, as their minds reacted from the heavy strain which had been upon them so long, the sense of dependence and poverty would assert itself, and tempt them to think of themselves as intruders. It was at the close of a lovely summer day that they sat on the piazza which commanded the finest view of the ocean, and discussed the future. Mr. Spafford himself opened the way by remarking that it must have been a very warm day in the city. "Yes," said Mrs. Temple, "and that reminds me of something over which I have been worrying a little. You will surely not think of taking baby back to the city until summer has entirely spent itself, will you? Our first months of autumn, you know, are liable to be quite as oppressive as midsummer. Baby had such a narrow escape that, it seems to me, you should hazard a great deal in trying to return before October at the earliest." The mother's heart gave a little thrill of satisfaction over this sentence. It was so pleasant to hear the past tense used in connection with her darling's illness. Others beside herself, then, accepted the danger as past. She was joyful and grateful. But the father's mind was occupied with another problem. He was thankful for the past, and foreboding for the future. He was the breadwinner of this little family, and saw no way in which to win any. The rent, too, had been accumulating, he having had only promises with which to pay the last month's balance, and now another was nearly due. Every Monday morning, when Mr. Temple returned to the city, he had said cheerily, "I will keep a lookout for you, Spafford, and I think there will be an opening of some sort soon." But openings in the commercial world at this date were not so numerous, at least such as would support a man with a family. Young men by the dozens stood ready to absorb any opening, and be content with small salaries. So Mr. Spafford's face was clouded. "I must go back to the city as soon as I possibly can, and look for work," he said, speaking quickly. "You forget, Mrs. Temple, that I have nothing but your unparalleled kindness to live upon." "I don't think that is true," she made answer in quiet tone. "You have your father's sure promise. But I don't want to trammel you. When Mr. Temple comes down again, you and he, talking it over, may decide it best to go back together and make arrangements for the future, but in regard to your wife and baby, I feel exactly like meddling. I don't think I could endure it to have my baby taken back to the city until I felt that it was safe. He is my only grandchild, you know, and I may be excused, perhaps, for being selfish over him. I think, Mr. Spafford, you should lay your commands on mother and child to stay quietly here with me while you bear the heat and burden of the day. I shall not go to town until the very last of October, probably, and I need not try to tell you how lonely I should feel without the mother and baby. I suppose you and Mr. Temple could keep Bachelor's Hall together, if it should seem necessary?" What answer could be made to such persistent kindness? The guests looked at each other, and felt almost embarrassed by this wealth of hospitality. How were they ever to express their gratitude? Mrs. Spafford, studying for the 100th time the whole matter, suddenly put it into a question which she had longed to ask. "How came you to do it, Mrs. Temple? I mean, what induced you to take us in this unworldly fashion, and do for us, and with us, as if we were your very own?" "You make altogether too much of it," said Mrs. Temple, speaking lightly. "Is it so strange a thing that a woman with a house at her disposal, and leisure on her hands, should be heartily glad of pleasant friends about her for the summer? Especially when there was a baby like our War included? Still, I know what you mean. By what line of impulse or suggestion did it first occur to me? You will doubtless be surprised, my dear friend, to learn that you were the starting point. Do you remember that first missionary meeting downtown that you attended, and your prayer?" "I remember the meeting very well," Mrs. Spafford said, her cheeks flushing, "and the fact that I offered prayer, but what has that to do with this summer's experience?" "Much. There was that in your prayer which set me to thinking in a new channel. I had been accustomed to think of the foreign field as very widely separated from work at home. Two channels, you know, each feeding the ocean of God's work for the world, but stretched apart to such a degree that those who gave their lives to feeding one channel could not do much, in any way, for the other. Something in your language and manner made me feel that they touched each other, joined hands indeed; that I could lay my hand on my next neighbor's shoulder, and speak a word, or look a feeling, that could be made to reach to Africa or China. I cannot describe it very well, nor make it very clear to you, what a hold the thought took upon me; but I know I looked about on those with whom I came in contact with very different eyes from that time forth. I had felt myself consecrated, time, money, and strength, to the work of foreign missions. My father died in the work abroad, and my 2 brothers and a sister labor there today; and in short, I lived for the other side of the world, and thought it right. I still think it right, but I see fresh ways of doing it. I can reach China through my neighbor that I meet on the street. I am constantly saying to myself, who knows but what that little girl may do for China when she grows into a woman? Who knows what millions that little fellow, playing at my neighbor's back door, may give for Japan or India? Am I making my meaning plain? I don't believe I am, but it is plain to me. When I heard of my blessed little War's illness, without any idea as to how I should come to love him as my very own, I instantly said to myself, how can I know but his life is to be saved, through me, so that he may, in the years to come, touch all heathendom with his influence? I got that out of your own prayer, Mrs. Spafford. It came to me as it never had before, and I have enjoyed living twice as well since then. It is not that I love China less, you know, but my neighbor more. The Lord has opened fresh streams, and given me a chance to help swell their current for the same great end." And her eyes were shining with tears. Just at that moment there appeared in the door Master War Spafford, in Nurse Philbrick's arms. That devoted slave of his was to leave him on the morrow, and had been enjoying a last love scene with him in the nursery. His mother arose to take him, and, as she pressed his velvet cheek to hers, she said, her voice slightly tremulous with feeling, "We will try to train this little boy that the love and wealth you have lavished on him may bring an 100-fold reward to the foreign field." After that, both parents believed that they would have been silly, as well as ungrateful, to have pressed the idea of going away, in the face of Mrs. Temple's expressed advice to the contrary. Still, the father's face was shadowed, and he was plainly growing restive. Some move he must make, or his manhood would suffer. The dignity of suffering, and the foreboding of coming sorrow that had held him prisoner, were lifted. War was able to roll in the sand, and shout at the waves, and frolic, in one way and another, during every moment of his waking hours. His cheeks were growing round and plump again, and his eyes were bright with health and the joy of living. The father felt that he must be at work. But it was 2 days after the talk on the piazza that he was summoned to the parlor to meet a caller. The conference was a somewhat lengthy one, but he came away from it with a bright light in his eyes, and ascended the stairs 2 steps at a time in search of his wife. "Callie, dear," he said, going over to her, "I shall have to go to the city without you, and before the time we had planned." "Why?" she asked him, not startled. His face was too bright for any news that was not pleasant. "I think from your face, Warren, that you must have an opportunity for employment, and, indeed, I think from my heart that such must be the case. My faith has been stronger all the morning." "Then I can reward it with a bit of sight," he said gleefully. "Callie, do you remember that carpet clerk of whom we bought our carpet, how interested he seemed in our twists and turns to save a penny, and how patient he was with us?" She remembered him perfectly, the wife declared, and moreover had often thought of him, and wondered whether he had a happy home. "Well, it is he who has been calling on me. He brought me great news. Mr. Temple, it seems, had heard that there was a vacancy in their house, and called in person to present my name. But there were a dozen applicants, and, but for what we are apt to term an accident, it would have done no good. Mr. Johns, the carpet clerk, was standing by, and recognized my name. It seems he had been more or less interested in us ever since. His little sister met you at a missionary meeting in the city, and fell in love with you, rushed up and kissed you, so he says. Do you remember her? He is a favorite in the house, has served them faithfully for a number of years, and they were disposed to listen to his advice. He had heard me mentioned favorably by our firm more than once, and suggested that they send to inquire into the particulars of my leaving their employ. This was done, and Mr. Burton himself told the whole story, giving me an excellent name, Johns says, and admitting that he considered himself hasty in discharging me. Well, when McAllister and Hayes heard the story, they both, being members of the Sabbath committee, and staunch advocates of a stricter observance of the day, agreed in 5 minutes to give me the vacancy, and sent Johns, who was coming down here for a 2 weeks' vacation, to interview me this morning, and tell me I might report at their establishment to-morrow morning, if I chose. "To-morrow morning!" repeated Mrs. Spafford, with a little sinking at her heart despite the good news. Their first separation was then near at hand. "Yes, it is sudden, dear, but, after all, not too soon for me to go to work. An able-bodied man cannot sit down idly and let others feed him a minute longer than the providence of God seems to hold him there. You can come home in a little while, Callie. I can get all ready for you and the boy, and only think what a boy you will have to bring back. Besides, there is something else. You haven't asked me as to salary? What do you say to 1,000 a year, Robin Ruff?" And the foolishly happy father sang out the refrain of the old tune, stopped in the middle of a strain by a warning shake of his wife's head and a nestling in the crib. "Really, Warren?" "Really, Callie, with a prospect of increase if I succeed in meeting their requirements. Which I can, for they have the name of being as fine a firm to work for as there is in the city." What do you think was Mrs. Spafford's second thought connected with this whole matter? She turned toward her husband, her soul shining in her eyes, her very voice radiant. "Oh, Warren, then we will have $100 a year for the jewel case. We had nothing for it this month, apparently, because you were earnestly trying to follow the Lord's own command. And now we have it almost doubled, and the influences can be traced back to the same cause. Isn't that wonderful?" "That reminds me, Callie, there is another point. I don't know what you will say to this. Johns wants to come out and board with us. He says he must get away from the city. Stuffy room he has, you know, and poor board, nothing homelike. I feel sorry for him. I told him we would consider the matter and let him know. I thought possibly you could see your way clear to giving him that extra room, and perhaps use his board to pay a girl with, and so get a little leisure yourself, as much as this fellow will give you. How does it strike you at first thought?" Mrs. Spafford's face clouded for a moment with a perplexed look, then cleared. "I had designs on that room," she said brightly. "I thought possibly we could make it do actual missionary work for us. But then who knows but this may be the Lord's appointed way for us to do it? This Mr. Johns isn't even a Christian, is he? Yet how do we know but he may be worth everything to the cause some day? Perhaps Mrs. Temple is right, and each little movement of ours tells. not only for the work at home, but for the great world abroad, if only our faith reaches out and grasps them all. Yes, Warren, I think we will make a home for him if he wishes. I feel as though I would like to make homes for everybody and take them all in. As for Mr. Johns, I have had a fancy for him ever since he waited so patiently while I changed my mind a dozen times about our carpet. We'll buy a pretty one for his room, won't we? Oh, see what the mail has brought me! A letter from our treasurer, with the largest remittance for my share in the business that I have ever had yet. That scheme is going to succeed royally. I feel it more than ever. Warren, I think I feel, just a little, as David did when he said, 'My cup runneth over.'" Now, passing over the long, quiet rest, when mother and child grew strong together, when Mrs. Spafford and her hostess grew daily more closely united in Christian love and sympathy, and took sweet counsel together, I shall let you peep into the little house deserted so suddenly on that summer morning, for this is the family reunion. All day long has the neighbor, Mrs. Evans, been moving with tireless feet about the rooms, giving them a home-like air. At supper time they were expected, and she has set the table in holiday array, in the bright dining room, and mindful of a certain supper table which marked a new era in her home life, and has made delicate little puffs of soda biscuit for supper, and stewed potatoes in milk and broiled a steak, and she knows perfectly well, as she surveys all the nice appointments of the table, that Mrs. Spafford herself, pattern housekeeper though she may be, could not have improved upon the details of that meal. The expected ones have arrived, and are moving about upstairs at this moment, washing away the dust of travel. The Temple carriage brought them but a half hour ago, even as it had taken them away, but what a gay, bright, rollicking baby is returned to them in place of the wan shadow they carried away. "I shan't know him at all," had Mrs. Evans declared, to the satisfaction of the mother. She shivered even yet over the recollection of the pitiful little face he carried away. "How brown he is!" exclaimed the father, and the mother laughed, and declared that it was the sunshine on the sand, that he had done nothing for 6 weeks but roll around in the sand and shout and crow. Oh yes, it had been a joyous homecoming. "We invited ourselves to supper," explained Mrs. Evans, as she seated the lady of the house and motioned her own husband to his place. "I knew you wouldn't be able to find things the first evening. I don't suppose I have them in the right place, but I know where they are, and that is all that is necessary at present. To-morrow, Mrs. Spafford, your Phyllis is to come. Don't you think, her name really is Phyllis? She knows how to do everything, so she says, and she looks as though she might know a good deal, especially about some things. I know I am glad she is to be your help, and not mine." Mr. Evans laid down his knife and fork to laugh. "My wife retains her horror of hired help in full force to this day," he said, with evident satisfaction. "You haven't had one around since Betty left you in the lurch that rainy morning, have you?" "Not for an hour," she said complacently, "and I confess it would give me a little twinge of disappointment to be obliged to have one. But you are mistaken, Dane, about the horror. I have lost all the old feeling of utter helplessness that used to come over me when I used to try to find fault without knowing wherein the fault lay or how to remedy it. It is a very different sensation to remember, if your help chooses to get offended and leave just at dinner time, that the dinner will not necessarily suffer in consequence. The trouble was, I was a slave to my ignorance until Mrs. Spafford gave me a taste of freedom." Upstairs, after the dining room had been set in orderly array, the two ladies moved about, Mrs. Evans turning down the blankets of the pretty crib and making it ready for its occupant, and the mother, as she laid the happy boy within, and tucked the snowy coverings carefully, turned to her friend with a sweetly solemn smile on her face, as she said, My friend, I have you also to thank for this hour. Under God, you saved my baby to me. I have never put into words how much I thank you for your swift, silent, thoughtful work, but God knows how I have remembered it and always shall. I have lately come to feel what is to me a somewhat new idea about it. Who can tell what God may let those little hands, or that baby voice, do for his glory in the turning of the nations of the earth to himself? And if he gives him great things to do, will not part of the work be yours? What wonderful rewards God may have in store for even our smallest efforts made for his sake! I understand about the cup of cold water better than I ever did before." Mrs. Evans's eyes were moist as she answered humbly, "It is but a very little commonplace thing that I could do. I was just a simple errand girl, and carried a message to those who could and did. But my motive, I think, was love for you, my friend. I can claim no blessing from the Master." "Ah, can you not? Inasmuch as ye did it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, ye did it unto me." Chapter 23 of the Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23 Measuring Responsibility. "We must go home early tonight and give these people a chance to rest." This was what Mr. Evans said in one form or another several times during the earlier part of the evening, yet they lingered. Some absorbing topic of conversation would be immediately started by one of the circle, and the half movement to separate would be forestalled. The Evanses were so glad to get their neighbors back again, and the neighbors, on their part, were so gratefully glad to be back again, that it was hard to separate. Even when Mr. Evans actually arose and said, "Now really, Eva, we ought to go," Mrs. Spafford said just at that moment, "Oh, Mrs. Evans, I wanted to ask you about Jennie. Do you think she—" And here the ladies' chairs were drawn closer, and the tones became confidential. The two husbands looked at each other and smiled. Then something in Mr. Evans's face, a sort of wistful yet hesitating look, sent a telegraphic dispatch to the other gentleman's heart. They had been thrown much together, these two, during the weeks that had intervened since Mr. Spafford's return to the city, and he had tried to be a faithful witness for his Lord. So now he laid a detaining hand on the other's arm, and said in a voice of grave yet winning inquiry, "My friend, is the great question settled yet?" Slowly and gravely Mr. Evans shook his head. Yet he seemed relieved and grateful that the subject had been started, and Mr. Spafford, watching his face for a moment, ventured further. "I wish I knew just what is in the way. It has sometimes seemed to me, when I have been talking with you, as though you came up to a sort of stone wall which prevented you from taking another step. I wish I could know whether there is really an obstacle, and what it is. Perhaps we could together lift it out of the way." "There is an obstacle," declared Mr. Evans with an emphatic voice, after just a moment of irresolution. "You are right. I cannot take another step until an intervening question is decided." Meantime, Mrs. Spafford, who was deeply interested in the inquiries she was making, became suddenly aware that her friend's interest was elsewhere. The truth is, Mrs. Evans was in such a state of constant longing for her husband's decision on the momentous question, was so on the alert to have him influenced in the right direction, that the moment the question was presented her heart seemed to take warning, and be ready to stand sentinel. Mrs. Spafford, following the direction of her eyes, saw her giving eager, almost painful heed to the conversation which was taking place over by the window. Therefore, both of the ladies heard Mr. Spafford's next question. "Is it anything that you are willing to tell me about?" "The fact is," said Mr. Evans, after another thoughtful pause, I can't make a profession of one thing and live a life that is at variance with it. In other words, I can't continue in my present business and be a Christian. At least, it doesn't seem to me that I can. I have always regarded the temperance question as one of the most important with which a Christian had to do, and I have always been secretly ashamed of the Church because it did not take strong enough ground on this subject. Now, with my eyes as wide open as that, could I support my family from such a business, and at the same time claim myself as belonging to a master who, I believe, hates the whole thing? But, Mr. Evans, you have nothing to do with the selling of liquor. It was his wife's horrified voice that asked this question, or rather made this distressed statement. It was the first intimation her husband had that the conversation had become general. He turned toward her with a somewhat sad smile. The keener brain of the man had, years before, seen through the delicate film of respectability with which others had enshrouded his business, and which had satisfied his wife. "No, dear, but I buy it. That is, I pay for it, large sums of money every month, and make out bills of it, and deal with it in a dozen different ways. In fact, I have to do with the management of liquors as much as though I owned the entire establishment." "Well, but," urged his wife, distress still apparent in her voice, "you are only the clerk. You have no responsibility in the matter. It isn't your liquor, and you get no money for its sale. The responsibility of selling it doesn't belong to you." "My dear wife, I might say the same thing if I were a clerk for old Green, down here at the corner, and sold bad whiskey at so much a glass. You see, there is no such thing as shirking responsibilities in that way. I get my living from the sale of that which I believe to be a curse to the world, and whether I pour it into a glass or count the money that is paid for it, seems to me to have very little to do with the real question. To be sure, I can say, if I don't receive the salary, somebody else will, and I might as well have it as anybody. But the trouble with that argument is, it proves too much. A thief can use it. There are always people enough to steal, and I might as well share the plunder as anyone. How would you like that reasoning, Eva?" She smiled a wan sort of smile. She understood the illustration, and could not help seeing that the cases were sufficiently analogous to have it fit. Still, the idea was new to her, and hateful. "I have never thought of such a thing," she said, drawing a long breath. "If it has seemed so to you, Dane, I wonder that you have borne it so long." "Yes," he said, his face darkening, and he arose and began to walk up and down the room. "That is just the difference between Spafford here and myself. He sees things and does them, and I see things and shirk them, and one can't be a Christian and do that last, in my opinion. So there I am. Don't you see, Spafford, I haven't a chance to take any steps?" "No," said Mr. Spafford emphatically, "I don't see anything of the kind. If your reasoning is clear, you have a very serious step to take." "Aye, that's the trouble, too serious. You see, it is all we have to depend upon, my wife and I. For a long time I settled down upon the thought that it was a man's duty to take care of his family, and that I must not give up my situation until I secured another, and I have been secretly at work for months trying to find an opening. But there isn't any such thing as an opening. Apparently I am shut up to this one place. I haven't heard of even a possible chance for something in the future. I told myself that it was plainly my duty to hold on here, that it was equally my duty not to make a public profession while I was so engaged, and I've been trying, if ever a man did, to live two lives. I have tried hard to act like a Christian and feel like a Christian, and I can't do it. I feel more like a hypocrite than anything else. Still, it wasn't very plain to me what I ought to do until your trial hour came, Spafford, and with less to live on than I have, and more at stake, you swung off on what looked like a very little matter, too. I heard a member of the same church as yourself criticize you sharply, classing your line of conduct as belonging to those who strain at a gnat and swallow a camel, though he omitted to say what camel you had swallowed. Well, it opened my eyes. As soon, at least, as I would allow myself to open them. I called you a fool for a few days, but I knew all the time that you were simply an honest man with a live conscience. By the same sign I knew that I wasn't. I see plainly now what I ought to do, but I haven't advanced an inch. I shrink from it as hard as ever. How can I deliberately relinquish our only chance of support and fold my hands? Spafford, do you see how I can do it? Now tell me, what would you advise?" "What does Mrs. Evans advise?" It was Mr. Spafford who asked this question, whereupon her husband turned toward her a distressed look. It was evident that he did not expect his wife to understand or appreciate the awful straits to which he was reduced. She was a temperance woman in a sweet and quiet way, but she had never been what her uncle had called a temperance fanatic, and the definitions of society had heretofore given her complete, unquestioning satisfaction. How could she be expected to see what the light of God's own Spirit had made plain to his keener mind? It was evident that her husband shrank from the ordeal presented to him for his wife's sake. During these last 2 years she had grown peculiarly, inexpressibly dear to him. They had been years of rest in his home. What he had supposed was a quiet little spirit had suddenly, 2 years before, arisen and asserted its freedom from domestic thraldom. She would have no more of the so-called help that she had hitherto endured about her. She would be her own mistress, and do her own work. Her husband had laughed sarcastically, and looked on moodily, but the resolute housekeeper had held steadily on her way. She spent long hours in the Spafford kitchen, concocting mysteries which blossomed into results on their own table. She steadily held her own one evening against first ridicule and then positive annoyance, until she literally made her husband say just what sum he thought they could safely spare for the week's household expenses. His reluctance to tell her, arising from the fact that he knew much better than she did how alarmingly small it was in comparison with what they had been using. But she received the figures meekly enough, and set about apportioning them after the fashion that she had learned from Mrs. Spafford, and neither then nor afterward did she call for a larger sum. On the contrary, she steadily saved from the week's allowance, until one evening she amazed her husband by producing enough to pay a certain bill, which had chafed his nerves and driven sleep from his pillow for hours together. It was not until after that event that Mr. Evans actually opened his eyes wide to see that a thorough domestic reform had been inaugurated in his home, and that the wheels were running smoothly. Since which time he had been sure of one thing, that his wife was a woman of rare wisdom and skill and tact as regarded the management of a home. Great comfort had they enjoyed in their home during these 2 years. A little box of a place it was still, but as pretty a home as one need care to see, and every night when he hastened to it, Dane Evans realized that the genius who presided within grew dearer. Yet by so much more did he want to shield her from outside winds. She had learned to use the means he brought, to make a very restful Eden of the home. Could he expect her to think it would be either wise or right to withdraw all the visible means for sustaining it? Make beggars of themselves, indeed. It was hardly fair to appeal to her for advice, yet Mr. Spafford had done it. At the mention of her name, Mrs. Evans arose from her seat. Her eyes were bright, her cheeks were glowing. She went over to her husband, and clasping both her hands over his arm, in a fashion she had when they were alone, and she was very much in earnest, she spoke exactly as though she had forgotten, as indeed she had, that there were any others present. "Oh, Dane, how is it possible that you can hesitate one moment? I have prayed and prayed, and cried before God, begging him to bring you to a decision. I knew he was calling you. I could not think what stood in your way. I am not wise about these matters, you know, Dane, and I never thought of this. I cannot tell you how glad, how very glad and grateful I am that it is not my miserable inconsistent life as a Christian that was holding you back. I know you had a very high ideal, and I knew I fell so far short. But Dane, don't, oh, I beg of you, don't for one moment let the thought of how we shall live keep you from giving yourself to Christ. He will take care that we do not starve, unless he wants us to starve for his sake. And I'm sure that would be no harder than many other things. We can't do just as he wishes, Dane, you and I, but don't let us for one moment go contrary to his plain directions. If he has told you that the way we get our money is wrong, don't let us have another cent of it." Long before these eager, impassioned sentences were concluded, Mr. Evans had put his arm around his wife, and drawn her closely to him, and the tears were dropping from his eyes. Mr. Spafford, also, had drawn his handkerchief, and was clearing his throat in a suspicious manner. As for his wife, her eyes were too bright for tears. She had been confident that her quiet and gentle friend had depths of feeling and heights of self-renunciation that were not suspected, even by her husband. It was just as well for him to discover what a power he had beside him. Mr. Spafford arose, and went over to where the husband and wife stood. "Swing off, Evans," he said, earnestly. "There is no peace short of that. I have discovered, by my own experiences, that the Lord will have nothing to do with compromises. When he has made the right entirely plain to you, the manner in which you may be sustained, while you are treading the road of his pointing out, is in a sense not your concern. He will undertake it for you. Trust him." "I don't know how to trust," said Mr. Evans, tremulously. "I would like to feel trustful, but I certainly don't." "Faith is the gift of God," quoted Mrs. Spafford, in clear, ringing voice. It was the first time she had spoken. "Yes," said her husband, "that is one of the heart troubles which may be taken to him too. The question just now is, do you intend to accept him as your leader? Are you ready to resign your will to his, and walk in the paths of his pointing out, and no other? Evans, what you want is an effort of the will. You have been trying to do your own planning, to see your way perfectly clear, and when you had succeeded in arranging everything to your satisfaction, you were going to tell the Lord that you were willing now to serve him. I don't believe he would ever have opened a way for such service. What he wants is your absolute surrender into his hands." "I don't believe I understand you, Spafford. I dare say I am dull, but these things are all new to me. Now I might be really anxious to trust my affairs in your hands, but if my brain would keep working over them, trying to plan, I hardly see how I would be to blame, or how I could stop planning. I might resolve with all my might to stop, but the planning, I fancy, would still go on, almost in spite of me." "Let me take your own illustration, my friend, and complete it. Suppose me to be so powerful a friend that your judgment justified you in placing all your affairs in my hands, and your mind said, 'I will follow his directions in every particular. When any plan is suggested to my mind, I will take it at once to him, and whether his ways seem to me wise or not, I will follow them.' If that was the deliberate language of your heart, it would really, in one sense, make little difference how much planning you did. Don't you see, my friend, that your next step is to surrender your independence to the Lord, willing yourself to obey him?" Then there was silence in that little parlor while one of those deliberations was taking place, such as the angels watch over with intense interest. What would the issue be? Mr. Spafford silently pushed a chair forward, and Mr. Evans, rousing for a moment, placed his wife in it, drew a seat beside her, and sat down, his face shaded by his hand, himself evidently in deep and troubled thought. " There is one thing," said Mr. Spafford, suddenly breaking the silence, " that perhaps is hardly necessary to say, yet someway I feel like saying it. I know, by experience you remember, that the way looks somewhat dark when there is no apparent means of support. Yet no one certainly knows better than I do, than we do, how promptly friends start up for hours of need. So I wanted to remind you that so long as Callie and I have a home and bread, we are more than ready to share them with you until such time as your way shines clear." Mr. Evans reached forth his hand and grasped that of his friend. "God bless you," he said. "You are a true friend to me. I realize the actual disgrace I am to God, for being unable to trust my affairs with him. I don't feel an atom of trust. The way looks as dark as Egypt. But I plainly see what would be the right thing to do. And as you say, I can control my will, if I cannot my heart. And I will obey his directions, so far as I can see them, from this time forth. So help me God." "Amen," said Mrs. Spafford. "Let us pray." In a moment the little circle were on their knees, and the parlor, so often consecrated by the voice of prayer, was filled once more with words of consecration and thanksgiving. Directly Mr. Spafford's voice ceased, his wife took up the petition, and then Mrs. Evans, her voice so tremulous from pent-up emotion that she could hardly syllable the words, breathed forth the hopes and desires and longings of her heart. Then, a moment of silence, and a new voice was chronicled in heaven as among the list of those of whom it was said, "Behold, he prayeth." As they arose from their knees, Mr. Evans held out his hand again to his friend. "It is very strange," he said, smiling. "There is certainly nothing in my outward circumstances in any wise altered from what it was 20 minutes ago, but the heaviness of spirit is gone. I feel now as though I could trust him not only, but as though it were a pleasure to do so. May he bless you for what you have been to me. I don't believe I should ever have seen my duty in this matter, but for the step which you took in the dark for the honor of his name. And now we really must say good night, or rather good morning. I don't feel as though there were any night." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24, Measured in Prose. During the 2 years' break in our story, another home had been established. At least, they called it a home. It was in an upper story of one of those semi-genteel boarding houses which abound in large cities. 3 flights of stairs, a long passage down a dimly lighted hall, smelling of old carpeting, and you will reach the door of this home. A fair-sized room, carpeted in dingy colors, a once good Brussels of the exasperating kind which never wears into honest holes, justifying one in selling it to the ragman, but simply grows duller, grows threadbare, grows gloomy. Walls hung with large-figured dark paper to match the carpet, having grown old along with it. Curtains heavy and dark and gloomy-looking, grown old, too, like the dreary-faced keeper of this dreary boarding-house. A haircloth sofa, several haircloth chairs, one brisk little new-fashioned rocker in bright colors, an old-fashioned sofa bedstead, dark, solid wood, looking respectable but gloomy, and speaking, like the carpet and the curtains, of other days. Marble-topped dressing-bureau and wash-stand, the woodwork of which was sadly marred, this compromised the general furnishing of the room. To be sure, there were little home touches, tidies on the sofa and chairs, lace-trimmed pillow shams and bolster shams, knick-knacks of one sort or another on the high, old-fashioned mantel. All of these had a careless look, as though the owner had grown weary of keeping them in the daintiness of perfect order. Yet this one room, up 3 flights of stairs, is the spot where those two people, who went to the opera together on a never-to-be-forgotten evening long ago, are living out together the prose of that life which began in poetry during their homeward ride. More than a year had Will Coleman and his wife spent in this room. They were together in it now. Jennie in careful costume, for they had just come up from dinner, which was served at a fashionable hour in a fashionable dreary basement dining room, with certain fashionable surroundings in the shape of handsome old dishes and a few solid silver pieces, and when you had said this you had said all that was to be commended about the meals served there. Still, because of the silver pieces, and the once fine furniture, and the faded Brussels carpets, and the general air of decayed respectability, a large sum, viewed in comparison with their income, had to be paid. The question of income was a sore one to Jennie Coleman, even as it had always been an important one to Jennie West. The history of the last year of her life might be summed up in one sentence: a dreary effort to be what she was not, and to do what she could not. Her forehead was drawn in habitual wrinkles, a soured, discontented look was growing on her face, and in short, she looked as she sat there, reading the announcements of the evening amusements, as unlike the pretty girl whom Will Coleman had escorted to the opera 2 years before as can be imagined. She threw the paper aside presently, the wrinkles deepening on her forehead, and opened the conversation with a pettish exclamation. "I wish we could ever go anywhere." "What now?" It was Will Coleman who asked this short, not to say crabbed, question. He, too, had changed in the space of 2 years. He was growing older, there was no mistaking it. Gray touches were being given to his hair. Also, he was growing fleshy and red-faced. I find it very difficult to put the change into words. It is one thing to talk about a few gray hairs, and a few added pounds of flesh, and a florid look on the face, and quite another thing to sit and look at a familiar form, which was, only a short time ago, a very embodiment of alert, sprightly gentlemanliness, and realize the distinctly seen, yet indescribable change which marks him as an unsatisfied, unsuccessful, almost middle-aged man. I don't think Jennie Coleman saw this, in full force at least. But she knew him to be in many respects unlike the Will Coleman who had made a heaven for her out of that homeward ride in the moonlight. If the echo of the tenderness that was in his voice that evening could have reached to her to-night, as he said sharply, "What now?" the contrast might have brought the tears. But the truth was, her heart was not busy with retrospect. "Oh, nothing new," she said, the petulance in her voice being even more distinctly marked. "I was just looking over all the things that were going on to-night, and thinking how we sat here cooped up in this den, not able to go anywhere or do anything. Night after night the same thing, and the same old story of not being able to afford it dinging in my ears. I'm tired of it." "We have to pay enough for the den. We might have a degree of respect for it on that account. I've always observed that things which cost a great deal fill you with admiration. I don't see why you can't go to work and admire this establishment on the strength of that." "Oh, now, Will, don't try to be witty. You never were intended for distinction in that line. I don't know when you have had occasion to observe anything of the kind. It is very certain that I don't have a chance to prove my admiration by making any purchases in these days. I'm always ashamed to go shopping with any of the ladies in the house. I am the only one among them who never has any money to spend." "No, that's a great trouble of yours. You never have any money to spend, because you can't keep any until you need to spend it. Somebody spends a good deal more than I can earn, you know. I wonder who it is. Not this chap, anyhow. I've practiced economy to a degree that I never imagined possible in my bachelor days." "Oh, yes, you are a pattern of economy." The tone was so severely mocking that Will Coleman, albeit he had provoked it by his own rudeness, was startled, and looked over the paper he was pretending to read, studying his wife with a curious sense of wonder that one whom he used to know as Jenny West could use such words and such an accent. One great difficulty with the poor young husband was, that though he distinctly saw the change in her, he did not realize a corresponding one in himself. The cruel, mocking tones went on. "You never buy ices or fruits or dainty little lunches, or indulge in soothing trips up the lake at 50 cents an hour. If I were you, I wouldn't talk about economy. I was always considered an economist before I was married, but I wasn't in a perpetual state of beggarliness as I am nowadays." Now the truth was that Will Coleman, in the days of his bachelorhood, had been so accustomed to indulging in these which he was pleased to call trifling expenditures, that the habits were upon him, and during the earlier months of his married life he had continued them thoughtlessly, though rarely without bringing his wife something which he called an equivalent, in the shape of fruits or bonbons. Very soon, however, he discovered that all these things were really alarming leaks, and he was struggling manfully, if one can apply the word to so childish a habit, to avoid all unnecessary expenses. It is true that his definition of the term unnecessary needed correcting, but all the same he considered himself a slandered man, and his face flushed painfully during the earlier part of the sentence. But by the time Jenny had announced herself as having been considered an economist in the days of her maidenhood, he was ready to laugh. No one knew better than he how persistently all her loose change had lost itself in the vortex of ribbons, laces, gloves, and the like. The consciousness that she was really saying a foolish thing made Mrs. Coleman sensitive to her husband's laugh, and in no way softened her voice. "Oh, yes, you laugh, of course. That is your favorite method of treating your wife's views and opinions. But I can assure you that I never dreamed of having to twist and turn through life in this way. If I had, I should have considered long before I put myself in such a position." "You ought to have married a rich man." Her husband's voice was controlled, and she did not realize how her words had stung him. "I wish to goodness I had," she declared, driven to desperation by his apparent indifference. "Amen," he replied promptly and with emphasis. Then he turned the page of his paper and apparently went on with the business of reading the news. As for Jenny, she sat looking out of the window down the rows of tall chimneys which shut out all other view. Her heart was swelling with indignation. She considered herself an ill-used woman. This conversation, miserable though it was, is actually a fair specimen of the sort of talk in which these two often indulged. Do you suppose that either of them imagined the possibility of such a climax to that heavenly ride home from the opera? What an awful fact it is to have to record that there were times in which this husband and wife actually wished that the results which followed that evening's pleasure had never been. Not that they by any means hated each other, or indeed were entirely indifferent to each other, but the realities of married life had been too much for them, as they will be for all who do not start from a rock foundation. It is a painful thing to admit, but scenes like the one through which she had just passed were really too common to weigh with lengthened heaviness on Jenny Coleman, or make her long silent when she had an item of importance to communicate. So she presently broke the stillness with a question. "What do you suppose Dane Evans has done now?" "It is entirely beyond me to guess. Something unparalleled in folly, to judge from your tone." "He will be likely to consider it folly before he gets through with it." This sentence not whetting her husband's curiosity sufficiently to call forth a question, she continued. "Have you seen him to-day? Perhaps you know the whole story?" "Haven't seen him in 3 weeks. He and Spafford have so much in common nowadays that he has no time for me." "Well, he has thrown up his situation." "What?" "Yes, he has. Mrs. Peterson told me at lunch. And her husband is in the same office, you know, and heard all about it." "What has he done it for?" "For a piece of folly or sentimentality. Dane always was sentimental, in streaks. He never would have married Eva if he hadn't been." "What is he going to do?" "Nothing. Live on his conscience, I suppose. He professes it as a conscientious movement. I should think it had taken his conscience a long time to enlighten him. He has been there nearly 10 years." "Mrs. Coleman, enlighten me. What has conscience to do with Evans's clerkship? They haven't been requiring Sunday work, have they? And if they did, it wouldn't be any worse than Sunday lounging or Sunday riding, I should think. He has done enough of both. To be sure, though, he may have been taken with a desire to copy Spafford." "That is just what it is. He is trying to copy Mr. Spafford, and Callie sets him a copy which he dutifully follows. Now she is enlarging her circle, and taking Dane and Eva completely under her control." "You haven't enlightened me yet as to what it is all about." "Why, can't you see?" with a strong flavor of impatience in her voice. "Your conscience is certainly not tender on the subject. He has decided that to be a clerk in a liquor dealing establishment is a sin. Therefore he has thrown up his situation and is going to live on public charity, or church charity. I hear he is going to unite with the church next Sunday. I suppose they'll support him and call him a martyr for a few weeks, until they get tired of him, then they will throw him off, and he may go to the poor house for all they will care. I must say I'm sorry for Eva. Papa never thought Dane Evans would amount to much, and it seems he wasn't mistaken." "Do you really mean that Evans has given up there, with no other opportunity opening, and no knowledge of what he will do next? And there hasn't been any quarrel or dissatisfaction or anything of that sort?" "Yes, he has done just that. Mrs. Peterson said the firm argued with him, expressed their entire satisfaction, asked if he had other prospects, and hinted pretty plainly that if it was a question of salary they were ready to do as well by him as any other firm. But he boldly declared he could not stay if they doubled his salary, that money had nothing to do with it. He had no place in view, no prospects. It was purely a question of principle. Said he had been thinking the matter over for a long time, but had only recently come to a definite conclusion. That means since Callie Spafford came home. She is such a born fanatic herself that she cannot rest easy on her pillow until she sees someone preparing to become as wild a lunatic as herself." Will Coleman's paper had dropped to the floor, and his eyes were gazing into vacancy in a thoughtful way. Whether he had heard the last few sentences did not appear, but what he said was entirely foreign to their tenor. "I must say that is astounding. Dane Evans is more of a man than I had the least idea of." Now there was that in this sentence which irritated Mrs. Coleman almost beyond control. She could not herself have defined what it was, at least she would not have liked to do so, but she answered, with increasing asperity, "Indeed, your penetration is entirely beyond me. I fail to see the slightest evidence of manhood or even common sense in such an idiotic proceeding as this. It may be a cause for admiration to see a man deliberately shirk his only means for supporting a wife and hide behind an affectation of principle, but as I said, I fail to see it in that light. However, my eyes are getting opened. You gentlemen who have always been such ardent admirers of Callie Spafford stand ready to follow her lead without regard to common sense. I shall expect next to be informed that your conscience won't allow you to sell eggs and butter and cheese for Mr. Prime any more, because his other branch store sells tobacco and cider vinegar." Her husband laughed, and stooped down and picked up his paper. If his wife had not been too much excited to observe it, she would have felt that his laugh was exceedingly unpleasant in its tone. So was his voice. "Don't you be afraid of any such catastrophe. I have been tutored by a very different feminine from your friend Mrs. Spafford. I know better than to indulge in any such expensive principles. At the same time, I am not so reduced but that I can admire high-toned actions in another, and I say Dane Evans is more of a man than I had the least idea of. If I were rich, I'd see to it that he didn't suffer for his convictions, and his determination to carry them out. As it is, I can only admire at a distance. I have no hopes of ever emulating. Meantime, I have an item of news to communicate. Evans isn't the only man who has planned a change of base. I've given up my clerkship. No more butter and eggs to sell. So you see you needn't fear my being demoralized about the tobacco and cider." His wife turned entirely away from the window, and gazed at her husband with a half frightened, half incredulous air. She did not know what she feared. It could not be that any such scruples as Dane Evans had yielded to could have crossed his path. So far as she knew, there was no opportunity in his work for conscientious scruples. And also, if there had been, she had lost her former idea of him. She never quoted him in her thoughts any more as a perfect Christian gentleman. She waited a moment, then said, "Well, why don't you explain? What do you mean?" "Wasn't my meaning plain? I said I had given up my clerkship." "And what do you mean to do now? Starve in company with my half-witted cousins?" "No, I never expect to starve in such good company. Evans has gotten ahead of me somehow. A few years ago I used to be quoted as immensely beyond him spiritually, whatever that may mean." And the sentence ended with that disagreeable laugh. His wife was growing alarmed. "Mr. Coleman," she said haughtily, "if you can manage to be serious long enough to tell me what you are talking about, I should be glad. You certainly appear very strange to-night." "Do I? That is because I have made such a violent effort to give you pleasure to-day, and I am succeeding so well. I have taken a leap into respectability such as once I had no idea of. I'm Fargo, Belmont and Company's confidential clerk. Salary $2,000 a year. You can hunt a new boarding place and get a $40 bonnet and 3 pairs of 10-button kids as soon as you please." "Who are Fargo, Belmont and Company?" "Wholesale liquor dealers. The most extensive firm in the city. Oh, it is eminently respectable. They never sell less than a barrel of it at a time." "But, Will, you will not have to sell liquor?" The evident dismay in her tone seemed to amuse him. "No," he said, with a burst of laughter. "Oh, no, not at all. I only keep a sharp lookout that other people buy plenty of it, and pay for it." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Shirking Responsibility. Her husband's communication had filled Mrs. Coleman with astonishment. She had, it is true, been the prime factor in bringing about this change in his business, but she did not realize it. The simple fact is that Jennie Coleman had been one of those girls, and had become one of those women, who did not realize anything. Individual responsibility was a question that she had not studied. She had married, as many another has, without any distinct idea of the responsibilities of married life. Take, for instance, that one question, money, which really from first to last is productive of more evil, perhaps, than any other domestic question under the sun. And when Jennie Coleman assumed her place in life as a matron, what did she know about it? Her father called himself poor, and her life had been a struggle, she believed, with poverty. But her idea of struggling was to coax her father, and in later years her mother, until she succeeded in making them realize that she must buy the thing she wanted, or must go to the place she selected, or must do the thing she pleased. And once convinced, the money was forthcoming somehow. Why should it not be the case in her married life? Her father had always been managed. Why should not her husband need management? She utterly ignored, or to do her justice, she never understood, the difference between a man of business, who, though it may press him hard, and he may think the demand unnecessary and therefore foolish, can nevertheless secure a few $100 additional, and push through from year to year, and a young clerk whose entire resources are covered by his monthly salary, and who can no more command an additional 100 or two than he can command an extra pair of hands to meet his emergencies. Utterly failing to recognize this difference, of course Mrs. Coleman had seen trouble. And trouble in various forms was deepening around her. She was opening her eyes daily to the fact that her marriage was a sickening failure. Her husband did not satisfy her, and it was a humiliating truth that she evidently did not satisfy him. Did she then really love her husband? Or, to go back of that, had she ever loved him? In all honesty and solemnity, I have to answer no. I do not think she ever had. She admired him, she liked him, she was fascinated by his faultless manners and careful dress, and marked admiration of herself, and she labeled these feelings love, when she ought to have known that genuine love is both unselfish and discriminating. He, on his part, reached but very little higher in his views and feelings, except that he fancied himself ready to give her all he could, to take upon himself the responsibility of her support, to labor for her from day to day. In short, he realized, of course, that he was giving, and at times at least was willing to give, while she realized that she was accepting, and stood at all times ready to accept, whatever he could be prevailed upon to give her. Oh, I realize my own failure in trying to put this difficulty, that is as old as the world, into words. It is an oft-told story. I tell you, the excitement of the opera or theater, or of fashionable party life, do not fit people to make wise, deliberate, unselfish choices for life's journey. These two people had met each other 100 times, when they were well dressed and in society, and doing their best to shine. It was actually almost all they knew of each other until they met in that shabby genteel boarding house, bound to be companions, in hours when neither felt like making the slightest effort to shine in any way. Well, was the shipwreck which they were making of it absolutely necessary even then? No, oh no. Utter shipwreck of human happiness is rarely, thank God, a necessity, even though grievous blunders have been made. If Jennie Coleman had but begun her married life as a Christian woman, recognizing the responsibilities that she had assumed before God, resolved to struggle with her faults, resolved to bear with the faults of her husband, false and foolish as her ideas of married life were, she would have saved her heart from ruin, and possibly have been the human means of saving her husband's soul. But the greatest pity about it all was, that she professed what her keen-eyed husband came to believe she did not possess. Or, almost worse conclusion still, if she did possess it, he wanted none of it. And so, starting from narrow and selfish points, and dropping lower in the scale each day, at this time barely 14 months since they stood together at the altar and pledged each other in irrevocable vows, this husband had come to believe that what his wife wanted was money, however earned she did not care, money with which she could dress well, and ride where she chose, and have a good time generally with him for an unexceptionable attendant. And she believed that what he wanted was to spend his money on himself, shutting her out. And both believed that to have gone their separate ways would have made them happier. and it was still their individual happiness, and nothing else, that both were eagerly after. What but misery could there be in store for them? It seems now to be necessary to give you a careful view of this sudden change of business. Unlike Mr. and Mrs. Evans, this couple, in their parental homes, had come up under the shadow of a staunch temperance, or rather total abstinence, regime. Both grandfathers had been pioneers in the temperance movement, in the days when to be openly connected with such movements required heroism. The next generation on Jennie's side, it is true, had weakened a little, but still her father held strongly enough that to be connected in any sense with the making or selling of intoxicants was a very low social position. While Will Coleman had reason to feel as though his long-dead father would rise out of his grave, if he could, to rebuke his son for laxness in this matter. Now you may understand what a leap downward the change of business was. Down lower, it is true, for the man than for the woman, because he covered his position with no foolish subterfuges, such as brains can see through in a moment. He fully realized that he was connecting himself with the liquor traffic. But he realized also another thing, and it was this which increased his bitterness: that his wife would see the increased salary more plainly than she would anything else, and would make no opposition. Neither did she, to him, beyond that first startled question over which he had laughed in sarcasm. Then she gave herself up to what she told herself was the inevitable. "Will always does exactly as he likes. I have no influence with him." And she dressed herself carefully, and set out on the pleasant task of looking up a more congenial boarding place, better suited to their increased means. It was when the plans connected with their removal were nearly completed that Mrs. Evans came to call. Jennie went very slowly downstairs, glad of the confusion in her room, which prevented receiving her cousin there, and hoping that the parlor would be so occupied as to afford no chance for a tete-a-tete, not choosing meantime to define to herself the reason why she desired to avoid a private interview. There were many things in life which Jennie Coleman might have seen had she chosen to look at them. Her hopes were vain, the parlor was deserted, and Mrs. Evans occupied the little tete-a-tete alone. Mrs. Coleman, resolved on taking the defensive at once, explained that her room was so dismantled by reason of preparations for moving that it was not habitable. "Then it is true," said Mrs. Evans eagerly. "I heard you were going to move. Where do you go, and why? Oh, Jennie, I hope that the rest of what I heard is false." Mrs. Coleman, ignoring the latter part of this sentence, calmly and not without evident satisfaction, explained that they were about to go to the Central Avenue boarding house, that they were to have a room on the second floor, larger and in every way pleasanter than the one they were leaving, and that it would be in every way an advantage to them. The class of boarders was superior, the style of the house unexceptionable, and, besides, it would be so much more convenient for Will. "Oh, then it is true that he is going into Fargo and Belmont's employ." The exceeding disappointment in her cousin's tones was very apparent. "I didn't believe it when I heard the report. It seemed unlike Will. Oh, Jennie, how could you let him do it?" "What are you talking about?" said Mrs. Coleman, her face flushing, but struggling to retain a composed, good-natured voice. "I should think it was a subject for congratulation that we were to have as much again income. We have certainly demonstrated the impossibility of living respectably on the small sum that we had. As for letting Will do it, you ought to know by this time how certain a man is to do as he pleases without regard to a woman's advice. I did not know the least thing about this matter until it was all settled." She was not prepared for the sudden, pleased light in Mrs. Evans's eyes. "Did you not?" she said, still speaking eagerly. "I am so glad to hear it. I was afraid you had been tempted to yield to it because of the salary, but now you are in a position to protest. I am sure, Jennie, that you can influence Will. It is for your sake he is so anxious to secure a larger income. Most men care for money only on account of their family. I think Will is peculiarly one of that kind. See for how many years he has been content to work away in the store. He is thought so much of there, too. Dane says there is a certainty of his being promoted in time. Oh, you will find that you can influence him. In fact, Jennie, I believe he will be relieved and thankful to see you are unwilling to have him make more money at the expense of conscience. He has told Dane more than once how it chafed him to think that he could not give you the position in society that you were fitted to take. Now, when he finds that you care more for his highest interests than for any position which the world can offer, he will not only be influenced but touched." It was a long speech for Mrs. Evans to make. She was not a woman of many words, you will remember; and Jennie, in the midst of her embarrassment, not to say indignation, felt a sense of wonderment over the excitement and eloquence of her quiet cousin. Still she answered with impatience: "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Don't soar into the heroic quite so much, talking about Will's higher interests, and all that nonsense. I assure you he is no more fond of poverty than I am, and has chafed under it quite as much. As for promotion, he has been contented to plod along on the strength of that long enough. I am glad for my part that he has had the manliness to arouse himself and make a better provision for his family, though I am sure I did not urge him to do it." "But, Jennie, why don't you urge him against it? How can you endure it to have him engage in such a business as that?" "Really!" And Mrs. Coleman's laugh was almost as disagreeable as the one her husband had recently cultivated. "That is a very strange way to talk when one remembers that you and Dane have been living on the same business for years. Your horror is decidedly extreme, I should say, considering the recoil from it has been so recent." "It isn't quite the same position, Jennie. Dane was only a bookkeeper." Mrs. Evans's voice was lower, and the flush on her cheek had deepened. Mrs. Coleman did not realize what a fresh impulse she had given to her cousin's hatred of the business by this home thrust, nor how thankful she grew over the fact that now at least she was free from the stain. "Oh, that is all nonsense," declared Jennie, loftily. "No one but a child would think of making such distinctions. Dane was just as much connected with the sale of liquor as Will be. Only Will's position is one of greater trust, and his salary higher." "But," declared Mrs. Evans, "Dane is free from it now, you know, forever. I heartily wish he had been long ago. I take shame to myself that my eyes were not wider open." "He is free from everything that is calculated to support you, I should judge, from all I hear. What is he doing for a living?" Perhaps Mrs. Evans would not have been human had not the blood rushed violently even to her very temples at this cold home thrust; but she answered still with a quiet voice: "He has not found any position as yet, but of course he hopes to very soon. Meantime, we are not suffering, and we have grand friends." "Living on charity! I suppose as much. I wonder what your mother would think of that. Well, Eva, I must say I think that you and Dane are two fools. That is plain language, I know, but the occasion demands it. The idea of his giving up a clerkship that he has held so many years, for the sake of a passing whim suggested to him by other people. I'm sure if Will were as much influenced by the opinion of other women as Dane is, I should be sorry for him. The idea of Dane trying to follow Callie Spafford through all her fanatical absurdities is simply ridiculous, and you will see it in that light one of these days. I should never have believed that you would be such an idiot. If anything would drive Will into the very midst of the business, it is to see you and Dane shrinking in such fanatical horror from it, actually willing to be dependent on the charity of your poor neighbors." I do not know that Mrs. Evans said a word more than she had meant to say when she left home that afternoon, provided there should be occasion for such plainness of speech. But I think she may have said it more suddenly, and less tenderly, than, but for this strong provocation, she might have done. Her voice was still low, but it was the sort of lowness that betokens intense self-control. "Jennie, we need not discuss my husband's prospects or fanaticism. If his recent step was demanded of him by his conscience, God can take care of the results. He and I are both willing to trust our future in God's hands. But there is an entirely different question involved in your husband's position. Aside from a question of right or wrong, is it possible that you do not know what everybody else sees, that it is placing Will right in the line of his most awful temptation? Don't you know that the habit of drinking freely is growing on him every day, and that he is in awful danger of becoming a drunkard? Jennie Coleman, you might almost wish to see him buried, rather than launched on such a whirlpool as that into which he is entering. I came this afternoon to beg of you to use your influence to save him. I know you can do it." Now was Mrs. Will Coleman angry. More angry than she ever remembered being in her life before. She arose from her seat, and came over to where her cousin was sitting, and stood over her, her eyes blazing like two stars, and spoke in slow, measured tones. "Mrs. Evans, excuse me for saying that I think you have made your call of sufficient length, and I decline talking with you any longer, or receiving further calls from you. When a woman stoops to the act of insulting another woman's husband, incited thereto by a feeling of petty envy because her own husband has been a fool, and because the other is a rising business man, I think it is quite time that those two women should become strangers. You have chosen to uphold your husband in a piece of lazy folly. I hope you will not starve in consequence. Indeed, we will see to it, my slandered husband and I, that you do not actually suffer want. But as for being cousins any longer, or friends, I have no desire to claim the position." Then she gathered her silken robes about her, and sailed majestically out of the room. As for Mrs. Evans, she did just what you might suppose her to do next. She burst into tears, and sunk in a little crushed heap on the sofa in that great deserted parlor. Only a few minutes for crying. Then she arose, dried her eyes, rearranged her disordered bonnet as best she could, very thankful that the parlor was deserted, let herself out at the front door, hailed a passing car, and went home. What about the angry woman? Well, she too cried as soon as she reached her room. Angry tears. She had not the slightest idea of using her influence with her husband to alter his business arrangements. Do her justice, she did not believe she had influence enough to cause him to change his plans. At least, not now, after they had been announced to the world, and the new business all but entered upon. Also, do her justice to understand that she did not believe a word of the warning. Will took an occasional glass of wine. She was sorry for that. She had been surprised, years ago, that the son of such a temperance worker as his father had been, should be, ever so rarely, a wine drinker. But she did not believe that the habit was growing on him. She did not in the remotest degree fear his ever being a drunkard. The idea! When his grandfather had been a hero in the temperance world 50 years ago. Besides, Will was a gentleman. She still believed it. He would never be a common drunkard. What unparalleled impudence it was to hint it to her, his wife. But, being a wife, why did she not recoil in terror from the bare suspicion of it, as it was hinted by other people, and throw her influence powerfully in the scale to prove its falsity? Oh dear! Here, as in every other moment of her life where plain seeing was needed, there was a glamour over Jennie Coleman's eyes. The simple fact is, that in her girlhood she had been, just as often as she could bring it about, an attendant at the theatre. She had wept over spurious woes and spurious ruins so often. She had rejoiced over sham heroic deeds so many times. She had applauded mimic virtues so much that nothing anywhere seemed quite real to her. She had, besides, a dangerous talent for the dramatic. It hovered over even her angry talks with her husband, and made her almost insensibly take the tragic air and manner of some favorite actress; and it is an actual fact that real as her anger was that day, intense as she supposed her feeling of wifely indignation to be while she answered Mrs. Evans's warning, she was tormented with the suggestion that her words were wonderfully well chosen, her manner excellent, and that the entire scene would have appeared exceedingly well on the stage. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Measuring Enthusiasm. Many a woman who is the fortunate slave of a young tyrant at home will be in a condition to sympathize with the frantic haste which Mrs. Spafford made on a certain Tuesday afternoon, in order to be on time at the missionary meeting downtown. An annual gathering, and one of special interest. Young Warren had so monopolized his mother for past months that she had missed several of the regular meetings, and therefore felt lost, or at least behind the times, and was particularly anxious to secure this entire afternoon. Notwithstanding the unceremonious way in which she disposed of her toilet, and the skillful quick step in which she went to the car, she was late and breathless when at last the usher tiptoed with her down the aisle of the well-filled church. Somebody was reading, and embarrassed as she was by her haste and tardiness, she paused suddenly as she heard a voice whisper her once familiar name, "Oh, Callie Howell!" Whose voice could that be? It sounded to her like a dream from out a long gone past. She gazed about her bewilderedly, then advanced doubtfully a few steps, and felt her dress gently twitched by somebody in the side aisle. Whose face was that? Where had she seen it? Was this a dream, or had she dropped back 10, 15, nearly 20 years into her early childhood? She took the seat made for her by systematic crowding, and held out her hand mechanically to receive the energetic grasp of somebody. "Have you forgotten all about Sallie Lewis?" a voice whispered. Sallie Lewis! Why, no, she remembered her. She was a young lady with curls and sweet blue eyes, a Sabbath school teacher, her teacher, and the little girls, herself included, used to call her their "dear Miss Sallie." Yes, but that was 20 years ago. Miss Sallie grew old, of course, married, went away. Where did she go? Oh, yes, she married a minister, went to India or China or somewhere. Mrs. Spafford had not thought of her for a dozen years, but all these events came crowding back upon her memory, called up by that whispering voice. Then she turned and looked fully at the lady. There were no curls, the fair, rosy cheeks were sallow and wrinkled, but the soft blue eyes were bright and smiling. "Yes, I am Sallie Lewis," she whispered, squeezing Mrs. Spafford's hand and indulging in a softly laugh, "and you are my dear little roly-poly Sabbath school rosebud, Callie Howell. You are not changed so very much after all. Tropical sunshine hasn't burned all the fairness out of you, you see." Just then came the voice of prayer, and both ladies bowed their heads, and Mrs. Spafford had time to call back her startled thoughts and realize that she was living in the present, and the sweet-faced, worn woman beside her was really her old-time teacher, a returned missionary. She felt a sudden accession of honor. She was richer in friends than she had remembered. She studied the quiet face beside her furtively, during the reading of the reports which followed, trying to see in this middle-aged and unmistakably careworn woman a photograph of their beautiful and idolized Miss Sallie. It was hard to do. She had evidently borne much of the heat and burden of the day. Her youthful freshness was long since gone, and in its place had come many lines of care. I have forgotten her name, or, let me see, did I ever know her husband's name? What a shame not to have kept within view of her work, and she my old teacher." This was Mrs. Spafford's mental comment while the reading of the reports went on. At last she bent toward the lady, who still clasped her hand with the tenderness that the child, Callie, remembered of old. "I don't know your name?" she whispered. Then the blue eyes that she remembered well flashed upon her a touch of their old archness, as she spoke a name well known in missionary circles, and recognized instantly by Mrs. Spafford. She had actually read extracts from her letters in public meetings, and had never known that she was quoting from Sallie Lewis. "Oh, I didn't mean that," she whispered back instantly. "I know your name very well, indeed. I mean, I don't know you. Why, I mean—" and then both ladies laughed. It was all so curious. Then directly, of course, they sat erect and gave serious attention to those reports. The idea of two middle-aged ladies laughing in a religious meeting, and one of them a returned missionary! Great as was her eagerness to have a little talk with her old friend, Mrs. Spafford could not but become interested in what was soon transpiring around her. The reports were inspiriting. The accession of members had been large, the new auxiliaries many, during the past year, and the treasurer's report so far surpassed anything that they had had before, and anything that had been expected, that the ladies clapped their gloved hands with energy before its reading was concluded. Then several of the speakers seemed endowed with the very spirit of Christ that afternoon, so simply eloquent were their appeals, so telling the incidents which they had to relate of sacrifice and progress and reward. Peculiarly was this the case with Mrs. Temple's closing address. Her heart was more than ever aglow. She had prepared herself carefully, not so much with many statistics as with a few facts, which she told in such a manner as to bow many heads and bring to the surface real heart tears. Mrs. Spafford, listening to her, rejoicing with her in the progress of the cause, had nearly forgotten the honor of her own position in sitting beside one who had actually lived the experiences to which Mrs. Temple was referring, until some reference to the field in which she labored made her turn suddenly toward her friend for sympathy. She was amazed and distressed to discover that not a trace of sympathetic feeling could be found on her face. She sat erect, composed and almost indifferent. Nay, there was worse than indifference on her face. There was just the shadow of a smile hovering around her mouth, and actually a sarcastic curve to the upper lip. The very curve which Callie Howell as a child remembered when something had occurred to arouse her bright young teacher's opposition. What could be the explanation? Mrs. Spafford felt a cold chill at her heart, and turned her head quickly, and was so absorbed by her painful wonderings that she forgot to join in the solemn doxology which presently filled the house. The shadow of her discovery embarrassed her, so that when the meeting formally closed, and the missionary turned eagerly toward her, she knew not what to say. "Why didn't we hear from you this afternoon?" was her first wonderment put into words. "Oh, I am to speak this evening at the Union meeting," she said indifferently. "I am glad to be relieved from duty this afternoon. Talking doesn't signify, we have too much of that. What we want is living." "Of course," assented Mrs. Spafford. "But most of those who talk at this meeting are living, too. Do you know Mrs. Temple? You will know her, of course. She is very prominent in this work, and such a grand woman. Oh, Sallie, how you must miss such gatherings as these with sympathetic Christian women all around you. I never realized it so much before. But what a heavy cross it must be to give up all such helps." "Do you think so?" the returned missionary said, and there was a strange light in her eyes. "It does not impress me in that way. I wouldn't live in this country again for anything. It seems to me I should suffocate." Her cheeks were glowing, and her whole manner indicated intense feeling. Her listener stood aghast. "I can't think what you mean," she murmured. "Of course, you do not want to give up your work. I can understand that, and of course it is a blessed work. But I thought there were sacrifices to make." "There are, but they do not come to me in the way that you have indicated. I'm not sure that I can make my meaning plain. You don't know how it impresses me, all this, and oppresses me. I feel as though you were all playing at missions. Think of the papers that have been read here this afternoon, and the addresses that have been made. Every one of them referred to sacrifices, and rejoiced over the thought of being counted worthy to bear the cross for him. Bah! Pardon the expression, but it makes me sick. What have they ever sacrificed for him? What do they know of the meaning of the word? Look around you on every side. Do you see any evidence of retrenchment? I am very familiar with that word. It has been rung at us in all its changes for the last 4 years. Our boards harp about it, and our private letters of instruction teem with it. We must curtail, and curtail, and curtail, until we have sent children whom we had a chance to rescue from vice in its worst forms, back into heathendom, because the church at home couldn't furnish us with the paltry sums of money needed to carry on our work. We met one evening in the mission house, and went over our bills, and planned, and twisted, and turned, and then some of us cried, and said, 'It can't be done. Some of the girls must go from the school. There is nothing more that we can curtail.' Now look at these ladies. I have been studying them all the afternoon. I wish I hadn't. I could almost wish that I might be blind while I am in this country attending missionary meetings, so that I might hear and not see. But my eyes are wide open. What do I see? A lace collar on this side, real lace too. I've not forgotten how the real article looks, costing enough to support one of our girls at school for a year. Silk dresses, 2 of which would give one of our boys a good education. Jewels such as would replenish the entire treasury. Bonnets, oh dear, what would not that row of bonnets bobbing all the afternoon just in front of me have done for our girls' school last year? And the owners of these very bonnets moved gracefully down the aisle and read their pretty little reports about its having been a year of much self-abnegation and earnest effort for the beloved cause. No, I don't want to come back to civilization to live. I know I should suffocate. I would much rather, as a matter of personal comfort, spend my life among the Africans. They are heathen, you know. We don't expect much of them." She had talked very rapidly under the spell of evidently strong excitement, and Mrs. Spafford stood spellbound before her. Not knowing what to think or to say, unable to utter a word, relieved indeed from the necessity of doing so, for at that moment 3 members of the executive committee swooped down upon the returned missionary and carried her off in triumph. A captive, to shake hands with scores and scores of pretty ladies in elegant toilets, who were waiting for the honor to be bestowed upon them. Mrs. Spafford stood looking after her in sorrowful silence for a moment, then turned and went slowly down the aisle. She was going home. She could not stay to hear her dear old teacher, Sallie Lewis, talk that evening, though the desire to remain was now greatly intensified. But Master Warren had objected to her having an evening out. Indeed, it was through Mrs. Evans's self-sacrifice that she had been enabled to come this afternoon. She must hasten home to relieve her. But she certainly had food for thought. And I do not know that it is any wonder that baby had a very thoughtful, preoccupied sort of mother for companion the rest of the day, nor that he hailed with a crow of delight his father's late homecoming. He came with news. "I meant to be early to-night," he said, bustling about with War mounted on his shoulder. "I was going to smuggle you off downtown with Evans and his wife, and look after this young man myself, but we were detained by special business. Something happened. I'll tell you about it when I get some water. Sit down, young man, until I bring your mamma a pitcher of water. Oh, I saw Joe this afternoon. He says Phyllis will be back to-morrow. She has had her tooth filled and is all right." What had happened was on this wise. Extra work had been the portion of several of the clerks in the great store for the last few weeks, owing to the absence of one of its most trusted employees. He had broken down suddenly in the midst of a busy life, and was reported from day to day as seriously sick. Every morning for 2 weeks Mr. Spafford had heard one or another of the partners remark that it was a great inconvenience to have Holbrook away just now. He was doing well, they believed, but the illness was likely to be tedious. It was almost impossible to supply his place temporarily. Still they could not lose him for considerable, and must hold on as well as they could. Meantime, as the days passed, it was known to but few that Mr. Evans was living a precarious life. His deliberate resignation of his clerkship, with the frank reasons therefor, had caused but a 9 days' wonder among his acquaintances, and had not, of course, caused even a ripple in the great business world, where he was not known at all. He had taken his place in the visible church, and certain members, good earnest men, business men, temperance men, had shaken hands with him and welcomed him with glad words, and assured him of their joy in hearing that he counted not his life dear unto himself, and then they had gone their busy ways. There was no vacancy in their gift, they knew no way in which to help him, save with kind words. Those they gave, and said to one another, when they met for the first few days, that they hoped he would get a good position soon. He ought to. Such backbone as that should be able to make its way in the world. And then they had forgotten him. Others, of the same church, unhesitatingly said that they considered he had been rather faster than was necessary, or even modest for so young a Christian. He could at least have felt justified in waiting until the Lord opened some door for him. The man who did not provide for his own household was worse than an infidel, and then they too had forgotten him. During these days the most rigid economy was practiced in the little box of a house. Mrs. Evans, taking lessons of her wifely love and resolute determination to help her husband through this struggle, developed a talent for making palatable dishes out of nothings, that she felt sure even Mrs. Spafford might have envied. Chances here and there the husband found to help hurried men for a day or two, work for which sometimes they paid him in money, and sometimes in hearty thanks and a promise to do the same for him some day when they had leisure. These last he appreciated, but could not pay his rent with them, and the days looked at times heavily shadowed. There was always sunshine for them, though, in the house across the way, and hearty welcomes, and numerous invitations to dinner, to tea, even to breakfast when an excuse could be found. Oh, the ways were constant and quiet and soul-sustaining, which these poor neighbors found to aid each other. Weeks before, Mr. Spafford had presented his friend's name at his own place of business, urging that it might be placed on the list for future vacancies. But the list was long, and the prospect of vacancies exceedingly slight. "I don't know of a probable chance, perhaps in years," had the foreman said to him but the day before. "Of course, sickness may occur, but in that case we wait, as we are doing with Holbrook. He is better, by the way. I hope we shall have him back in a few days." And yet it was only the next morning that, as Mr. Spafford sat at his desk running up a column of figures, a passing clerk paused a moment to say to him, "Did you know that Holbrook was gone?" "Gone where?" And the bewildered clerk tried to remember the sum of the column, and talk at the same time. "Why, his disease took a turn for the worst last night at midnight, and just at daybreak he died." "Is it possible?" And Mr. Spafford was thoroughly aroused. It had not seemed to occur to any one that the man who had sat so long on that high seat, behind that railing, and plodded through such a weary stretch of business, could possibly die. Mr. Spafford sat with pencil poised in air for some minutes, unable to settle down to the routine of work, when so solemn an enemy had invaded their ranks. Yet even while he sat there his mind went to speculating on the strangeness of the fact that death could come so near, and yet not really touch him. Here was taken from their midst a man beside whom he had sat every working day for 3 months. He would never sit there again, and yet it did not affect his interests, or himself in any sense. How easily could Mr. Spafford think of those, the very suggestion of whose death as possible sent a cold chill to his blood. Human brotherhood is a strange, distant thing after all, he told himself musingly, then bent his head and worked away. It was towards the close of the next day that he was summoned to the private office for an interview with the heads of the firm. "This friend of yours, Mr. Spafford," said the senior, motioning him to a seat, "is he still out of employ?" And receiving an affirmative answer, he added, "Could you conscientiously recommend him to fill the position which you have occupied since you have been in our employ?" With steady lips, but paling face, Mr. Spafford answered, "Yes, sir." Could this mean that they were dissatisfied with him? Never mind, he would do as good a service for his friend as he could. And he forthwith gave as rapid and condensed an account of his peculiar business qualifications as he could. "I think I will try him," said the chief. "If you know his address, Mr. Spafford, you may communicate with him to that effect. We would be glad to see him tomorrow morning. Meantime, you know, of course, of the vacancy in our ranks? Well, sir, we have unanimously elected you to fill the place. To hope that you will prove as faithful to the firm, and to the right, as the one who has fallen, is to wish great things from you." "Callie," her husband said, breaking the little silence which had fallen between them, after the wonderful news had been talked over, "what will our jewel box think of having $300 a year in it?" Chapter 27